The scream that tore through the desert silence was raw and primal, a sound that made Jackson Ingram pull hard on his horse's reins and freeze in the saddle under the scorching June sun of 1882. He had been riding for 3 days straight from Nevada into California, delivering a message to a ranch outside of Skidoo, and the last thing he expected to find on this desolate trail was another living soul, let alone one in such obvious distress. The sound came again, weaker this time, and Jackson's weathered hands moved before his mind fully processed what was happening, urging his horse toward a cluster of rocks about 50 yards off the main path. What he found made his heart slam against his ribs. A woman lay on the hard, packed earth, her back against a smooth boulder, her face contorted in agony. Her dress was hiked up past her knees, revealing pale legs streaked with dust and something darker, and her hands were clenched so tight around a piece of driftwood that her knuckles had gone white. She was alone, completely and utterly alone, and even from 10 feet away Jackson could see that she was in the final stages of labor. "Sweet Jesus," he breathed, dismounting so fast he nearly lost his footing. His horse, a sturdy roan named Copper, snorted and backed away, but Jackson barely noticed. He dropped to his knees beside the woman, his mind racing through everything he knew about birthing, which was precisely nothing beyond what he had seen with cattle and horses on the ranch where he had grown up. "Madam, can you hear me? I am Jackson. I am going to help you." Her eyes flew open, and they were the most striking shade of green he had ever seen, even glazed with pain and exhaustion. She tried to speak, but another contraction seized her, and the scream that came from her throat was pure animal terror mixed with determination. Jackson watched helplessly as her entire body tensed, her back arching away from the rock. When the contraction finally passed, she gasped for air and managed to focus on him. "The baby," she whispered, her voice hoarse and broken. "The baby is coming now." "I can see that," Jackson said, trying to keep his voice calm even though his pulse was thundering in his ears. He had faced down armed outlaws, survived a stampede, and once spent 5 days lost in the mountains with nothing but his knife and his wits, but this was different. This was a life hanging in the balance, maybe 2 lives, and he had no idea what to do. "How long have you been out here?" "Since yesterday," she managed, and then her face crumpled. "My husband, he left me. We were traveling to Skidoo, but we fought and he just rode off and left me here. I thought he would come back, but then the pain started and they would not stop." Jackson felt a surge of anger so fierce it nearly choked him. What kind of man would leave a pregnant woman alone in the desert? But there was no time to dwell on it. The woman cried out again, and this time he could see the crown of the baby's head, dark and wet, beginning to emerge. "All right," he said, forcing himself to focus. He had delivered foals before, had helped pull calves when they got stuck. This could not be so different, could it? "All right, I need you to push when the next pain comes. Can you do that?" She nodded, tears streaming down her dust-streaked face. "I have been pushing. It hurts so much." I know it does." Jackson pulled off his vest and spread it on the ground, then positioned himself between her legs, trying not to think about the impropriety of it all. This was life and death. Modesty had no place here. "What is your name, Grace?" she gasped. "Grace Voss." "Well, Grace Voss, you are doing just fine. You are the bravest woman I have ever met, and we are going to get this baby born safe and sound." He had no idea if that was true, but he said it with such conviction that he almost believed it himself. "Now on the next contraction, I need you to push as hard as you can." The contraction came less than a minute later, and Grace bore down with a guttural moan that seemed to come from the very core of her being. Jackson watched as the baby's head emerged further, and without thinking he reached out and cradled it in his calloused hands, supporting the tiny skull. The skin was slippery and warm, and he could see a shock of dark hair plastered to the scalp. "That is good, that is real good," he encouraged, his voice shaking slightly despite his best efforts. "One more big push and I think we will have the shoulders." Grace was sobbing now, but she nodded and gathered herself for the next contraction. When it came, she pushed with everything she had left, and Jackson felt the baby's shoulders slip free, first one and then the other. And suddenly the entire tiny body was sliding into his hands, slick and red and absolutely perfect. Without thinking, he lifted the baby and turned it slightly, clearing the cord from around its neck, and then he was staring down at a little human being, a boy who was not making any sound at all. Panic seized him. "Come on," he muttered, tapping the baby's back gently. "Come on, little one, breathe." Nothing. Grace was crying, reaching for the baby, but Jackson barely heard her. He turned the infant over and used his finger to clear mucus from the tiny mouth and nose, then tapped the back again, harder this time. "Breathe, damn it." And then, as if the baby had just been waiting for the right moment, a thin wail broke from those miniature lungs, weak at first but growing stronger. Relief flooded through Jackson so powerfully that his hands shook, and he carefully placed the baby on Grace's chest, where she clutched the child to her with trembling arms. "He is breathing," she sobbed. "Oh God, he is alive." Jackson sat back on his heels, his head spinning. He had just delivered a baby. A human baby. He looked down at his hands, still stained with blood and fluid, and then back at Grace, who was cradling her son with a fierce protective love that made something deep in his chest ache. "We are not done yet," he said quietly, remembering what he had seen with cattle births. "The afterbirth still has to come." Grace nodded weakly, too exhausted to speak. Jackson retrieved his canteen from Copper's saddle and brought it back, helping her drink while she held the baby with one arm. The water seemed to revive her slightly, and she looked at him with those green eyes, now filled with gratitude and something else he could not quite name. "Thank you," she whispered. "You saved us." "You saved yourself," Jackson replied. "You did all the hard work, I just caught him." They waited together in the shade of the rocks while Grace's body completed the process of birth. Jackson used his knife to cut the umbilical cord, tying it off with strips torn from his spare shirt. He was gentle and methodical, trying to remember everything he had ever seen or heard about what came after a birth. When the afterbirth finally came, he wrapped it in more cloth and moved it aside, then helped Grace adjust her clothing as modestly as possible. "We need to get you to town," he said, scanning the horizon. The sun was past its zenith now, starting its slow descent toward evening, but it was still brutally hot. "Skidoo is about 15 miles east. Can you ride?" Grace looked down at her son, who had latched onto her breast and was nursing weakly. "I do not know," she admitted. "I am so tired. I know you are." Jackson stood and walked back to Copper, thinking quickly. He had some dry jerky and hardtack in his saddlebag, along with a wool blanket. It was not much, but it would have to do. He pulled out the blanket and brought it back, wrapping it carefully around Grace and the baby despite the heat. She needed to stay warm, needed to conserve what little strength she had left. "Here is what we are going to do," he said, crouching beside her again. "I am going to help you onto Copper, and I am going to hold you and the baby in front of me while we ride. We will go slow and careful. It will take us maybe 4 or 5 hours to reach Skidoo, but we will get there before dark." "I cannot ask you to do that," Grace protested weakly. "You have already done so much. You are not asking. I am telling you." Jackson's voice was firm but kind. "There is no way I am leaving you out here, and there is no way you can make it on your own. So we do this together, understand?" She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks again. "I do not even know how to thank you. You can thank me by staying awake and holding tight to that baby." Jackson stood and held out his hand. "Come on now. Let me help you up." Getting Grace onto the horse was harder than he had anticipated. She could barely stand, let alone climb into a saddle, and the baby complicated everything. But Jackson was patient and strong, and eventually he managed to lift her up and settle her in front of the saddle, then swing up behind her. He positioned her so she was leaning back against his chest, the baby cradled between them, and wrapped one arm securely around her waist. "If you need me to stop, you tell me," he said, taking up the reins with his free hand. "Do not try to be tough. If something is wrong, I need to know." "All right," Grace whispered. She was already slumping against him, exhausted beyond measure, but her arms remained locked around her son. They rode through the afternoon heat, following the trail that wound through the desert landscape toward Skidoo. Jackson kept Copper to a steady walk, mindful of every bump and dip in the road. Grace drifted in and out of consciousness, and several times Jackson had to tighten his grip to keep her from sliding sideways. The baby slept, oblivious to everything except his mother's warmth and heartbeat. As they rode, Jackson found his mind wandering to the woman in his arms. She was beautiful, even covered in dust and sweat and exhaustion. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins and hung in waves down her back, and despite everything she had been through, there was a strength in her that he could not help but admire. What kind of life had led her to this moment, alone and abandoned in the desert? What kind of man would do such a thing? The sun was touching the horizon when the buildings of Skidoo finally came into view. It was a small mining town, rough and dusty, with a main street lined with saloons and supply stores, and a handful of houses scattered on the outskirts. Jackson headed straight for the doctor's office, which he knew from his previous visits was on the south end of town, and dismounted carefully, easing Grace down into his arms. The doctor, an older man named Samuel Fisher, answered Jackson's urgent knocking and immediately ushered them inside. He took one look at Grace and the baby and started barking orders, clearing off his examination table and calling for his wife to bring water and clean linens. "What happened?" Dr. Fisher demanded as he gently took the baby from Grace's arms to examine him. "She gave birth out on the desert trail," Jackson explained, his voice rough with exhaustion. He had not realized how tired he was until he stopped moving. "I found her alone. I delivered the baby myself." The doctor's eyebrows shot up, but he did not comment. He was too busy checking the infant, listening to his heart and lungs, examining his color and reflexes. After a few tense minutes, he nodded with satisfaction. "The baby seems healthy, all things considered. Small but breathing well. You did good work out there, son." Jackson felt a wave of relief so profound he had to sit down. "And Grace, I mean Mrs. Voss." Dr. Fisher moved to examine Grace, who was conscious but barely responsive. "She is exhausted and dehydrated, and she has lost some blood, but I think she will be all right with rest and fluids." "You got her here just in time." He looked at Jackson with new respect. "She is lucky you found her when you did. Another few hours and we might be having a very different conversation. Can I stay?" The words were out of Jackson's mouth before he even realized he was going to say them. "I mean, just to make sure she is all right. You can wait in the front room," the doctor said kindly. "My wife will get you some coffee, but Mrs. Voss needs rest now and some privacy." Jackson nodded and reluctantly left the examination room. Dr. Fisher's wife, a plump woman with kind eyes, brought him coffee and a plate of bread and cheese, and he ate mechanically, tasting nothing. His mind kept replaying the afternoon's events, the sound of Grace's screams, the feeling of that tiny baby slipping into his hands, the weight of both of them on the horse as they rode toward safety. He must have dozed off in the chair, because the next thing he knew, dawn light was streaming through the window and Dr. Fisher was shaking his shoulder gently. "She is asking for you," the doctor said. Jackson stood so quickly he nearly knocked over the chair. "She is all right. She is going to be fine. The baby too, but she wants to see you." Dr. Fisher led him down a short hallway to a small room where Grace lay in a narrow bed, the baby swaddled beside her. She looked better than she had the night before, her face clean and her hair brushed back, though there were still dark circles under her eyes. "Jackson," she said softly when she saw him, and he was surprised by how much he liked the sound of his name in her voice. "How are you feeling?" He approached the bed slowly, suddenly unsure of himself. In the light of day, everything seemed different, more complicated. "Sore and tired, but Dr. Fisher says we are both going to be all right, thanks to you." Grace reached out and took his hand, her grip stronger than he expected. "I've been awake all night thinking about what you did for us. You are a good man, Jackson Ingram." He felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I just did what anyone would do." "No." Her voice was firm. "Most men would have ridden past, pretended they did not hear anything. Or they would have panicked and made things worse. You stayed calm and you saved my son's life." She paused, looking down at the sleeping infant. "I want to name him after you if you will let me. Jackson Voss. It seems only right." Something tightened in Jackson's chest, an emotion he could not quite name. "That is a fine name," he managed. "I would be honored." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, just watching the baby sleep. Then Grace spoke again, her voice quieter. "I need to tell you something." "About my husband." Jackson tensed. He had been wondering about that, about the man who had abandoned her. "You do not owe me any explanations." "Yes, I do. You deserve to know the truth." Grace took a deep breath. "His name was Robert Voss. We were married 2 years ago in Missouri, and he promised me a good life out west. But Robert was not a good man. He drank, and when he drank he got mean. The trip west was terrible. He spent most of our money on whiskey and cards, and when I told him I was pregnant, he said it was the worst news I could have given him." Jackson's hands clenched into fists, but he stayed silent, letting her talk. "When we got close to California, I told him the baby was coming soon, that we needed to find a town with a doctor. But he just got angry. Said I was slowing him down, costing him money. We had a terrible fight on that trail, and I told him I would rather raise the baby alone than stay with a man who treated us like a burden." Grace's voice cracked. "So he rode off. Just left me there in the middle of nowhere. I thought maybe he would come back after he calmed down, but he never did." "Good riddance," Jackson said quietly. "A man like that does not deserve you or that baby." Grace looked at him, her green eyes searching his face. "The thing is, I am not sorry he left. I know that makes me terrible, but it is the truth. I would rather be alone with nothing than spend one more day with him." She paused. "But now I am alone with a newborn baby and no money and no plan, and I do not know what to do." Jackson found himself speaking before he had fully thought it through. "You could stay in Skidoo. It is a decent town, growing fast because of the mines. There is work here, opportunities." "What kind of work can a woman with a newborn baby do?" Grace asked, but there was hope in her voice, a spark of something that had not been there before. "There is a boarding house on the edge of town. The woman who runs it, Mrs. Patterson, she is always looking for help. And there is a school, needs a teacher. Can you read and write?" "Yes, my mother taught me. I even taught school for a year before I married Robert." Grace sat up a little straighter in the bed. "Do you really think Mrs. Patterson would hire me?" "I know she would, especially if I asked her." Jackson surprised himself with his own eagerness. And in the meantime, you could stay here with Dr. Fisher and his wife. They have room and Mrs. Fisher loves babies." "Why are you doing this?" Grace asked suddenly. "Why are you helping me so much? You do not even know me." Jackson was quiet for a long moment, looking at this woman who had been through hell and come out the other side with a baby in her arms and determination in her eyes. "Because you deserve better than what life has given you so far," he said finally. "And because that little boy deserves a chance to grow up safe and loved. And maybe because I cannot stand the thought of riding away and never knowing if you are all right." Something shifted between them in that moment, something profound and undeniable. Grace's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "All right then," she whispered. "All right, we will stay." Over the next few weeks, Jackson found himself spending more and more time in Skidoo. He had originally planned to deliver his message and move on to the next job, but somehow he kept finding reasons to stay. He helped Grace move into Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, carrying her few belongings and the supplies that kind townspeople had donated for the baby. He fixed the loose floorboards in her room and installed a better latch on the window. He brought her food from the restaurant when she was too tired to go downstairs for meals. And slowly, carefully, they became friends. Grace would sit in the parlor in the evenings after the baby was asleep, and Jackson would visit, and they would talk for hours. She told him about growing up in Missouri, about her parents who had died when she was young, about her dreams of becoming a teacher. He told her about his childhood on a ranch in Texas, about losing his family to fever when he was 16, about the years he had spent drifting from job to job across the West. "You ever get tired of moving around?" Grace asked one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the desert sky in shades of orange and purple. Jackson considered the question. "I used to think that was just the way I was made, you know, never staying in one place too long, never putting down roots. But lately I have been wondering if maybe I was just waiting to find a reason to stop." Grace looked at him, and in the fading light her eyes were luminous. "Have you found one? A reason to stop?" He met her gaze steadily. "I think maybe I have." They did not speak after that, but Jackson reached out and took her hand, and she laced her fingers through his, and they sat like that until the stars came out. As summer turned to fall, Jackson found work at one of the nearby ranches, breaking horses and mending fences. It was good, honest work, and it gave him a reason to stay in Skidoo without anyone asking too many questions. He rented a small room above the general store and became a regular fixture in town, attending church on Sundays and playing cards at the saloon on Saturday nights. But most of his time was spent with Grace and little Jackson, who was growing bigger and stronger every day. The baby had Grace's green eyes and what promised to be Jackson's dark hair, and watching him discover the world with wonder and curiosity made Jackson's heart ache in ways he had never experienced before. He was not the child's father by blood, but somewhere along the way he had started to feel like one anyway. One October evening, as Jackson was rocking the baby to sleep while Grace prepared dinner in the boarding house kitchen, Mrs. Patterson pulled him aside. "That woman loves you, you know," the older lady said bluntly. She was a no-nonsense type who believed in speaking her mind. "And you love her, though you are both too stubborn or too scared to say it out loud." Jackson felt his face heat up. "Mrs. Patterson, I do not think that is any of your business." "Maybe not, but I am making it my business anyway." She poked him in the chest with one bony finger. "Grace has been through hell. She deserves a good man, and you are a good man, Jackson Ingram. So stop dancing around each other and do something about it." "It is not that simple," Jackson protested. "She is still married. Even though that husband of hers abandoned her, she is not free." Mrs. Patterson made a dismissive sound. That rat left her for dead in the desert. Far as I am concerned, the marriage ended right then and there. And far as the law is concerned, if we can prove abandonment, which we can, she can get a divorce. Judge Henderson is coming through town next month. I will help her file the papers. Jackson's heart was pounding. Has she said anything about this? About wanting a divorce? She has talked about it, yes. But she is scared, Jackson. Scared of what it means, scared of taking that step. Scared maybe that you do not feel the same way she does. Mrs. Patterson softened slightly. Talk to her, be honest. Life is too short to waste time on being afraid. That night, after Grace had put the baby down and they were sitting together in the parlor, Jackson gathered his courage. Grace, can I ask you something? Of course. She looked up from the sock she was darning, her expression open and trusting. What are you planning to do about Robert? About your marriage? Grace's hand stilled. I have been thinking about that a lot lately. Mrs. Patterson says I can file for divorce on grounds of abandonment. Judge Henderson will be here next month. And are you going to do it? I think so, yes. I do not want to be tied to that man for the rest of my life. She paused, then added quietly, but I am scared, Jackson. Scared of what people will think, scared of being a divorced woman with a baby. Scared that I am making another mistake. Jackson moved from his chair to sit beside her on the settee. Look at me, he said gently, and when she did, he took both her hands in his. You are the bravest, strongest woman I have ever met. You survived something that would have killed most people, and you did it with grace and courage. Anyone who judges you for leaving a man who abandoned you in the desert does not deserve your time or your worry. Do you really believe that? Grace whispered. I do. And I believe something else too. Jackson took a deep breath, knowing he was about to step off a cliff but unable to stop himself. I believe that you deserve to be happy. I believe you deserve a man who will treat you the way you should be treated, who will love that baby like his own, who will never, ever leave you wondering if you are alone. Grace's eyes were wide, her breath coming faster. Jackson, what are you saying? I am saying that I love you, Grace Voss. I think I have loved you since the moment I saw you fighting to bring your son into this world. I love your strength and your kindness, and the way you sing to the baby when you think no one is listening. I love everything about you, and I want to be the man who stands beside you for the rest of your life. He paused, his heart in his throat. If you will have me. For a moment Grace just stared at him, and Jackson felt panic rising. He had misread the situation, moved too fast, ruined everything. But then she was crying and laughing at the same time, and she threw her arms around his neck with such force that he nearly fell backwards. Yes, she said against his shoulder. Yes, yes, yes. I love you too, Jackson. I have for so long, but I was afraid to say it, afraid that you would leave like everyone else in my life has left. Jackson held her tight, burying his face in her hair, feeling something huge and warm expanding in his chest. I am not going anywhere, he promised. I am yours for as long as you will have me. They held each other for a long time, and when they finally pulled apart, Jackson cupped her face in his hands and kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative, but then Grace made a small sound and pressed closer, and the kiss deepened into something that felt like coming home after a long journey. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Grace laughed softly. Mrs. Patterson is going to be insufferable when she finds out. She has been telling me for weeks that we should stop being foolish and just admit we love each other. Mrs. Patterson is a wise woman, Jackson said, grinning. We should listen to her more often. The next month passed in a blur of happiness and planning. Judge Henderson arrived in town on schedule, and with Mrs. Patterson's help, Grace filed for divorce. The judge, after hearing the circumstances of Robert's abandonment, granted the divorce immediately. Grace was a free woman. 2 weeks later, on a crisp November morning, Jackson Ingram and Grace Voss were married in the small church at the edge of Skidoo. Grace wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Patterson had helped her sew, and she carried a bouquet of desert wildflowers. Jackson wore his best shirt and pants, and he had even gotten a proper haircut for the occasion. Dr. Fisher gave Grace away, and Mrs. Patterson cried through the entire ceremony. Little Jackson, now 5 months old, slept peacefully in Mrs. Fisher's arms in the front pew, oblivious to the fact that his life was changing in wonderful ways. After the ceremony, the whole town gathered for a celebration at the boarding house. There was music and dancing and more food than Jackson had seen in years. People clapped him on the back and kissed Grace's cheek and admired the baby, and through it all, Jackson kept looking at his bride, unable to quite believe that this was real, that she was his. That night, in the small house Jackson had rented on the edge of town, they lay together in bed with the baby asleep in a cradle beside them. Grace was curled against Jackson's side, her head on his chest, and he stroked her hair slowly, feeling more content than he had ever thought possible. "Tell me something," Grace said softly. "What were you thinking that day when you found me? What was going through your mind?" Jackson thought back to that blazing afternoon in the desert, to the moment when he had heard her scream and made the decision to investigate. "I was thinking that I had to help no matter what. I was thinking that someone was in trouble and I was the only one around to do anything about it." He paused. "I was not thinking about falling in love, that is for sure, but I am glad I did." Grace laughed quietly. "I was so scared that day. Scared I was going to die. Scared my baby was going to die. And then you appeared like something out of a dream, and you were so calm and so strong, and I remember thinking that maybe God had sent you to save us." "Maybe he did," Jackson said. "I have never been a particularly religious man, but that day felt like something bigger than chance, like we were meant to find each other. I believe that too." Grace tilted her head up to kiss his jaw. "I believe we were always meant to be here together with our son." "Our son," Jackson repeated, loving the sound of those words. He had never expected to be a father, had never even really thought about it, but now he could not imagine his life without that little boy. "Do you think he will remember any of this when he grows up? The way we met, what happened?" "I think we will tell him the story," Grace said. "We will tell him about how brave his mother was, and how his father rode out of the desert like a hero and caught him with his own 2 hands. We will tell him that he was born into love, even if it took us a little while to realize it." "I like that," Jackson murmured, feeling sleep starting to pull at him. "I like that a lot." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, with their son breathing softly beside them and the desert wind whispering through the window. It was the first night of their new life together, and it was perfect. The winter months were hard but happy. Jackson continued working at the ranch, and Grace took a job teaching at the school, bringing little Jackson with her when he was old enough to sit quietly in a basket at the front of the classroom. The children adored him, and Grace was a natural teacher, patient and creative and full of enthusiasm. In the evenings, the small family would gather around the fireplace in their modest home. Jackson would work on repairing tack or carving small toys for the baby, while Grace would read aloud or work on her lesson plans. Sometimes they would just sit together in comfortable silence, watching their son grow and change, marveling at every new milestone. Jackson found himself transformed by fatherhood in ways he had never anticipated. The baby's first smile, directed at Jackson while he was making silly faces over breakfast, made him feel like he could conquer the world. The first time little Jackson reached for him instead of Grace, tiny arms outstretched in trust and love, Jackson felt tears prick his eyes. "You are such a good father," Grace told him one evening, watching as he paced the floor with the fussy baby against his shoulder. "I knew you would be, but seeing it still takes my breath away." "He makes it easy," Jackson said, patting the baby's back gently. "He is such a good little fellow. Never met a baby with a better temperament." "He takes after you," Grace said, smiling. "Calm and steady and sweet." "He takes after you," Jackson countered. "Brave and beautiful and stubborn as a mule when he wants something." They laughed together, and the baby, soothed by the sound and the motion, finally settled into sleep on Jackson's shoulder. When spring came, bringing wildflowers and warmer weather, Grace discovered she was pregnant again. She told Jackson one evening after they had put little Jackson to bed, her hands trembling slightly as she took his and placed them on her still flat stomach. "Already?" Jackson asked, his eyes wide with surprise and delight. "Are you sure?" "I am sure. Dr. Fisher confirmed it this afternoon." Grace bit her lip. "Are you happy? I know it is sooner than we planned." "Happy?" Jackson pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "Grace, I am thrilled. Another baby, another chance to watch you be amazing. How could I be anything but happy?" She relaxed against him, relief evident in every line of her body. "I was worried it might be too soon. Little Jackson is barely a year old, so they will be close in age. They will be good friends." Jackson pulled back to look at her face, his hands framing her cheeks. "You are worried about something else. What is it?" Grace hesitated, then said quietly, "I am afraid. Afraid of the birth. Last time was so terrible, Jackson. What if something goes wrong this time?" "Nothing is going to go wrong," Jackson said firmly. "This time you will be in a proper bed with Dr. Fisher right there, and I will be holding your hand the whole time. And if you are scared, you just squeeze my hand as hard as you need to. I can take it." "Promise you will not leave," Grace whispered. "I promise. I am never leaving you, Grace." "Never." He kissed her forehead, then her nose, then her lips. "We are in this together, all of it, the good and the scary and everything in between." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, much to Grace's relief and Jackson's constant vigilance. He fussed over her like a mother hen, making sure she ate enough and rested enough and did not overdo things at the school. Grace found it equal parts endearing and exasperating, but she knew it came from a place of love, so she mostly indulged him. Little Jackson seemed to sense that something was changing. He became more clingy, wanting to be held more often, especially by his mother. Grace would sit with him in the rocking chair for hours, reading to him or singing soft songs, her hand resting on her growing belly. "He is going to be a good big brother," Jackson observed one evening, watching his son gently pat Grace's stomach after she told him there was a baby in there. "I think so too," Grace agreed. "He has such a gentle spirit. I wonder where he gets that from." She gave Jackson a meaningful look, and he grinned. "Must be from you," he said. "Must be from us both," she corrected. The baby arrived on a cold January night in 1884, during one of the rare desert storms that brought rain and wind to Skidoo. Grace's labor started after dinner, and this time, just as Jackson had promised, she was in their own bed with Dr. Fisher and his wife attending, and Jackson right beside her, holding her hand. It was still difficult, still painful, but it was nothing like the terror and isolation of that day in the desert. This time Grace had support and safety and love surrounding her, and when their daughter finally arrived, squalling and red-faced and absolutely beautiful, Grace laughed through her tears. "A girl," she breathed, as Mrs. Fisher cleaned the baby and wrapped her in a soft blanket. "Jackson, we have a daughter." Jackson was crying too, he realized, tears streaming down his face as he looked at the tiny person who was already gripping his finger with surprising strength. "She is perfect. Grace, she is absolutely perfect." They named her Julia Grace, and she had Jackson's dark hair and what would eventually become Grace's green eyes. Little Jackson, who had been staying with Mrs. Patterson during the birth, was brought home the next morning to meet his sister, and he stared at her with wide, solemn eyes before declaring her small. "She will get bigger," Jackson assured him, lifting his son up so he could see the baby better. "And when she does, you will help teach her things, all right. That is what big brothers do." Young Jackson nodded seriously, already taking his new responsibility to heart. The next few years were full and busy and rich with love. Jackson took a permanent position as foreman at the ranch, which came with better pay and a small house on the property. They moved there when Julia was 6 months old, and Grace loved having more space and a proper kitchen, and a yard where the children could play safely. She continued teaching at the school until Julia was born, then stayed home for a year before returning part-time. The town had grown enough to support 2 teachers now, and Grace worked in the mornings while Mrs. Patterson or one of the other neighbor women watched the children. Jackson thrived in his role as foreman. He was good with the men, fair but firm, and he had a gift for working with difficult horses. The ranch owner, a man named William Thornton, came to rely on Jackson for everything, and there was talk of making him a partner in the operation. Can you imagine? Jackson said to Grace one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. Julia was asleep in her cradle, and young Jackson was playing with the wooden horses his father had carved for him. Me, a partner in a ranch. A few years ago I was just drifting around with nothing to my name but a horse and a saddle. You were always worth more than that, Grace said firmly. You just needed the right opportunity and the right reason to take it. The right wife, you mean. Jackson leaned over to kiss her, and she smiled against his lips. That too. In the spring of 1886, Grace discovered she was pregnant for the 3rd time. This pregnancy was harder than the previous 2, leaving her tired and sick for months. Jackson worried constantly, but Dr. Fisher assured him that some women just had difficult pregnancies, and as long as Grace rested and ate well, everything should be fine. Their 2nd son, James William, was born in October of that year, during the brief cool spell that passed for autumn in California. He was a big baby, nearly 10 pounds, and the birth was long and difficult. Jackson stayed with Grace through every moment, wiping her face with cool cloths and murmuring encouragement and telling her how strong she was, how brave, how much he loved her. When James finally arrived, healthy and loud and clearly already possessing his father's stubbornness, Jackson held Grace in his arms while she held the baby, and he thought about that day in the desert, about how close he had come to riding past and never hearing her scream, never stopping to help, never finding this life that had become more precious to him than anything else in the world. "What are you thinking about?" Grace asked softly, her voice hoarse from exertion. "About how lucky I am," Jackson said honestly. "About how different my life would be if I had not found you that day." "Our lives," Grace corrected. "If we had not found each other, it worked both ways, Jackson. You saved me, but I think maybe I saved you too." "You did," he agreed. "You absolutely did." Young Jackson, now 4 years old, was fascinated by his new brother. He would sit beside Grace while she nursed the baby, telling her stories about what he was going to teach James when he got bigger. Julia, at 2, was less interested in the baby and more interested in the fact that she was no longer the youngest. She became clingy and demanding, requiring extra attention and reassurance that her parents still loved her. "Of course we love you," Jackson told her one evening, holding her in his lap while Grace fed James. "We love you so much, Julia Bug. Having a new baby does not change that. Our hearts just get bigger so we can love everyone." "Big heart?" Julia asked, pressing her small hand against Jackson's chest. "The biggest," he confirmed. "Big enough to love you and your brothers and your mama forever and ever." That seemed to satisfy her, and she settled against him, sucking her thumb contentedly. The years rolled on, marked by birthdays and holidays and the ordinary rhythms of family life. Young Jackson started school and proved to be a bright, curious student. Julia was all energy and mischief, keeping Grace running from morning to night. James was the easy baby, content to sit and watch his siblings play, laughing at everything. Jackson and Grace grew into their partnership, learning each other's rhythms and moods, developing the kind of shorthand that came from years of shared experience. They argued sometimes, usually about money or discipline or how much time Jackson spent at the ranch, but they always made up quickly, neither able to stand being at odds with the other for long. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Jackson took Grace into town for dinner at the restaurant, leaving the children with Mrs. Patterson. They dressed up, Grace in a new green dress that matched her eyes and Jackson in a suit that he complained was too tight, and they sat across from each other at a small table and talked like they had in those early days, before the children and the responsibilities and the daily demands of life had taken over. "Do you ever regret it?" Jackson asked as they shared a piece of apple pie for dessert. "Marrying me, taking on this life. I know it is not what you probably imagined when you were a girl dreaming about your future." Grace looked at him with such love that it made his breath catch. "Not for a single second," she said firmly. "Jackson, you gave me everything I ever wanted and so much more that I did not even know to dream about. You gave me safety and love and a family and a home. You gave our children a father who adores them. How could I possibly regret any of that?" "I just want to make sure you are happy," Jackson said quietly. "That is all I have ever wanted. I am happy. I am so happy sometimes I can hardly believe it is real." Grace reached across the table and took his hand. "I love you, Jackson Ingram. I loved you when you caught my baby with your bare hands in the middle of the desert, and I loved you when you stood beside me through the divorce and the wedding and every moment since. I will love you until the day I die and probably beyond that too." Jackson felt his throat tighten with emotion. "That is exactly how I feel about you. I would do it all again in a heartbeat, every moment, just to end up right here with you." They left the restaurant hand in hand, and on the walk home, Jackson pulled Grace into the shadow of a building and kissed her the way he had wanted to all evening, deep and thorough and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Grace laughed softly. "Take me home, Cowboy," she said. "Mrs. Patterson is probably asleep on our couch by now, and I want you all to myself for a little while." "Yes, madam," Jackson said with a grin, and they hurried home through the dark streets of Skidoo, still young enough to run, still in love enough to laugh. In the summer of 1889, William Thornton officially offered Jackson a partnership in the ranch. It was a generous offer, 25% ownership in exchange for Jackson's continued work and a modest financial investment. It was everything Jackson had been working toward, but it was also a huge decision, one that would affect the entire family. He discussed it with Grace that night after the children were in bed, laying out all the pros and cons, the risks and rewards. Grace listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions, and when he was done talking, she smiled. "You want to do it," she said. It was not a question. "I do," Jackson admitted. "But it means taking money out of our savings, money we were going to use to build a bigger house. And it means I will have even more responsibility, more time away from you and the kids. It also means security for our family," Grace pointed out. "It means building something that we can pass on to our children someday. Jackson, if you want to do this, I support you completely. We will make it work. Are you sure? I do not want you to feel like I am choosing the ranch over you." Grace got up from her chair and came to sit in his lap, wrapping her arms around his neck. "I know you would never do that. You are doing this for us, for our future. I see that and I love you for it. So yes, I am sure. Take the partnership. Make our fortune, Mr. Ingram." He did take the partnership, and it proved to be one of the best decisions of his life. The ranch prospered, and with it, so did the Ingram family. They built that bigger house after all, a proper 2-story home with 4 bedrooms and a wide front porch and space for Grace's garden. Young Jackson, now 8, got his own room at last, and Julia and James were thrilled to have a room to share. Grace went back to teaching full-time once James started school, and she loved it, loved shaping young minds and seeing her students' progress. Some of the children she taught were from families that had been through hard times, and Grace had a special tenderness for them, remembering her own desperate situation all those years ago. Jackson often worked long hours at the ranch, but he made sure to be home for dinner every night, no matter what. That was family time, sacred and inviolable. They would sit around the big table in the dining room, and each person would share something about their day, and Jackson would look at his wife and his children and feel such profound gratitude that sometimes it was overwhelming. Young Jackson grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved books and horses in equal measure. He had his mother's green eyes and his father's steady temperament, and Jackson Sr. often thought he was watching a better version of himself develop. Julia was the wild one, always climbing trees and getting into scrapes, with a laugh that could light up a room. James was the peacemaker, sensitive and kind, always worried about everyone else's feelings. They were good kids, and Jackson knew he and Grace had been blessed beyond measure. In the fall of 1891, tragedy struck when a fire broke out in one of the mine shafts outside of town. 7 men were killed, including several that Jackson knew from church and town gatherings. The whole community was devastated, and Jackson found himself helping to organize relief efforts for the widows and children left behind. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings and planning, he came home to find Grace sitting on the porch steps, waiting for him. The children were already in bed and the house was quiet. "You all right?" he asked, sitting down beside her and putting his arm around her shoulders. "I have been thinking about those families," Grace said quietly, "about what they are going through. And I keep thinking about how easily that could have been us, Jackson. How many times you have taken risks at the ranch, working with dangerous horses or fixing broken equipment. What would I do if something happened to you?" Jackson pulled her closer. "Nothing is going to happen to me. I am careful, you know that. Those men were careful too, I am sure, but accidents happen." Grace turned to look at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I need you to know something. I need you to know that finding you was the best thing that ever happened to me. That every single day I thank God that you were riding that trail when I needed you most. I do not say it enough, but I need you to know." "I know," Jackson said softly. "I feel the same way about you. You are my whole world, Grace. You and those kids in there. Everything I do, every decision I make, it is all for you." They sat together in the darkness, holding each other, grateful for what they had and determined not to take a single day for granted. The years continued to pass, bringing changes and challenges and joys. Young Jackson graduated from school at 16 and went to work full-time at the ranch with his father, learning the business from the ground up. He had his father's gift with horses and his mother's head for numbers, and Jackson knew that someday the ranch would be in good hands. Julia, at 13, was beginning to discover that boys existed, much to Jackson's dismay. He found himself suddenly suspicious of every young man in town, convinced that none of them were good enough for his daughter. Grace found his protectiveness amusing and gently teased him about it, but she kept a close eye on Julia too, determined that her daughter would not make the same mistakes she had made at that age. James, at 11, was still trying to figure out where he fit in the family. He was not as physically strong as his older brother or as bold as his sister, but he had a gift for music, and Grace had managed to secure a piano for the house so he could practice. His playing filled the evenings with beauty, and Jackson loved sitting in his chair with his eyes closed, just listening. In the spring of 1897, Grace surprised everyone by announcing that she was pregnant again at the age of 37. The news was met with mixed reactions. The children were excited, though Julia did point out that she was old enough to be a mother herself now, and it was weird to think of her mother having another baby. Jackson was worried about Grace's health, remembering how difficult the pregnancy with James had been. But Grace was determined and happy, and Dr. Fisher, though cautious, said she was healthy enough to carry the baby to term as long as she was careful. So Jackson watched over her like a hawk, making sure she rested and ate properly and did not overdo things. Their daughter Margaret Rose was born in December of that year, a small but healthy baby with blonde hair like her mother had once had and blue eyes that would eventually turn to match her father's brown ones. She was a gift they had not expected, and she brought new life and energy to the household. Young Jackson, now 18, was endlessly patient with his baby sister, letting her grab his fingers and make faces at him. Julia, 15, took her role as big sister seriously, helping with diaper changes and feedings. James, 13, composed a lullaby on the piano just for Margaret, and it became the song they played every night before bed. Grace recovered from the birth more quickly than she had expected, and she and Jackson would lie in bed at night with Margaret sleeping between them, marveling at this unexpected blessing. "You remember what you said to me that day in the desert?" Grace asked one night, her voice soft in the darkness. "When you were delivering little Jackson." "I said a lot of things that day," Jackson replied, stroking the baby's soft hair. "You told me I was the bravest woman you had ever met, that I was doing just fine and we were going to get the baby born safe and sound." Grace turned her head to look at him. "I held onto those words like a lifeline, Jackson. They gave me the strength to keep going. You did not need my words. You had that strength already. Maybe. But you helped me find it." Grace reached across the baby to take his hand. "That is what you have always done for me. Help me find my strength, my courage, my hope. You are the best man I have ever known, Jackson Ingram." Jackson felt his throat tighten with emotion. Even after all these years, Grace could still make him feel like the luckiest man alive. "I love you," he said simply. "I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "And I love you," Grace replied, "always and forever." The years moved forward, bringing the inevitable changes that come with time. Young Jackson married a sweet girl from town named Elizabeth, and they had a baby boy of their own, making Jackson and Grace grandparents for the first time. Julia fell in love with a schoolteacher from Bakersfield, and though Jackson was initially skeptical, the young man proved himself to be worthy, and they were married in the same church where Jackson and Grace had taken their vows. James went off to San Francisco to study music, something that worried both Jackson and Grace, but they supported him because they knew it was his passion. He wrote letters home every week, full of details about his studies and the big city, and Grace read them aloud at the dinner table so everyone could hear. Margaret grew into a bright, curious child who asked endless questions and followed her father everywhere when he was home. She was the baby of the family, doted on by everyone, and she had a gift for wrapping Jackson around her little finger. The ranch continued to prosper, and Jackson became one of the most respected men in the county. He served on the town council and helped establish a proper school building to replace the old converted barn where Grace had once taught. He never forgot where he came from, though, never forgot those years of drifting with no purpose, and he always had time for young men who came looking for work or advice. Grace continued teaching until she was 50, then retired to focus on being a grandmother and helping with various charitable organizations in town. She was beloved by everyone who knew her, remembered for her kindness and her strength, and the way she had overcome impossible circumstances to build a good life. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Jackson took Grace back to the spot where he had found her that blazing afternoon in 1882. They rode out on horseback, just the two of them, leaving the children and grandchildren behind. The desert looked much the same as it had all those years ago, harsh and beautiful and unforgiving. They stood together at the place where Grace had lain, where their son had been born, where their life together had really begun. Jackson held Grace's hand, thinking about that terrified woman and the desperate situation, and the tiny baby who had slipped into his hands. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I had not heard you that day?" he asked. "If I had been riding too far away, or if the wind had been blowing the wrong direction?" "No," Grace said firmly, "because that is not what happened. You did hear me. You did come. You saved us, Jackson, and because of that, we have had this beautiful life. That is the only story that matters." "You are right," Jackson agreed. He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "You are always right. I love you, Grace. Thank you for saying yes when I asked you to marry me. Thank you for building this life with me. Thank you for giving me children and grandchildren and more happiness than I ever imagined possible." "Thank you for stopping," Grace replied, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for being brave enough to help a stranger. Thank you for loving me and our children so completely. You are everything I ever needed, Jackson Ingram." They held each other there in the desert, two people who had been brought together by circumstance and had chosen to stay together through love. The sun beat down on them, hot and relentless, but they did not care. They had survived this place once, and they had thrived because of it. When they finally rode back toward home, toward Skidoo and their family and the life they had built together, Grace looked back one last time at the rocks where she had nearly died, where her son had been born, where everything had changed. "Goodbye," she whispered, and it felt like closing a chapter, like finally letting go of the fear and pain and embracing only the joy that had come from it. Jackson heard her and understood. He reached over and squeezed her hand, and they rode home together, side by side, the way they had been for 25 years, and would be for however many years they had left. As they crested the hill and the lights of Skidoo came into view, Grace thought about that young, desperate woman who had been left alone in the desert, about how certain she had been that she and her baby would die there. She thought about the cowboy who had appeared like something from a dream, who had caught her baby with his own hands and then had stayed, had chosen her, had loved her. It was a story almost too incredible to believe, but it was their story, and every word of it was true. They had found each other in the wilderness, and they had built a family, a home, a life that was rich with love and laughter and purpose. That night, surrounded by their children and grandchildren at a celebration dinner, Jackson stood to make a toast. He raised his glass and looked at Grace, his eyes full of everything he felt. "To my wife," he said, his voice strong and clear. "The bravest, strongest, most beautiful woman I have ever known. 25 years ago today I married you, and it was the best decision I ever made. Every day with you has been a gift. Here is to 25 more years, and to the love that has carried us through everything. To Grace and Jackson, everyone chorused, raising their glasses. Grace stood and went to her husband, and he pulled her into his arms and kissed her while their children and grandchildren cheered and whistled. They were older now, with gray in their hair and lines on their faces, but when they looked at each other, they still saw the people they had been that day in the desert, still felt the same fierce love that had brought them together. After dinner, after the guests had gone home and the house was quiet, Jackson and Grace sat together on the porch swing, watching the stars come out one by one. Margaret was asleep upstairs, and they could hear James playing the piano softly in the parlor, some piece he was working on for a performance in the city. "You think we did all right?" Grace asked, leaning her head on Jackson's shoulder. "With the children, with our life, with everything." "I think we did better than all right," Jackson replied. "Look at our kids, Grace. Young Jackson is running the ranch like he was born to it. Julia is happy with her teacher. James is following his dreams. Margaret is healthy and bright and full of life. We raised good people. We built something solid and real. I would say we did just fine." "I suppose we did," Grace agreed. She was quiet for a moment, then added, "I hope they know how much we love them, how much we would do anything for them. They know. We have shown them every day of their lives." Jackson kissed the top of her head. "And when they have children of their own, they will understand even more. They will understand what it means to love someone so much that you would catch them with your bare hands if they were falling." Grace laughed softly at the image. "Is that what you did? Caught me when I was falling? That is exactly what I did, and you caught me right back." Jackson tightened his arm around her. "We caught each other and we held on and we never let go." They sat together in the warm night air, listening to the piano and the crickets and the distant sound of cattle lowing at the ranch. They had traveled a long road together, from that desperate day in the desert to this peaceful evening on their porch, and every step had been worth it. In the years that followed, they continued to build their legacy. Young Jackson took over more and more of the ranch operations, eventually buying out the other partners and making Ingram Ranch the largest cattle operation in that part of California. Julia had 3 children of her own, and she raised them with the same mixture of strength and tenderness that her mother had shown her. James became a respected composer and music teacher in San Francisco, but he came home often, and he never forgot where he came from. Margaret, the surprise baby who had brought such joy to the family, grew up to be a doctor, inspired by Dr. Fisher who had delivered her, and by the story of her own birth, of how her father had delivered her oldest brother with no training, just determination and love. Jackson and Grace grew old together, their love deepening with each passing year. They never took each other for granted, never forgot how easily things could have been different, never stopped being grateful for the life they had built together. On their 40th wedding anniversary, surrounded by children and grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren, Jackson gave a speech that made everyone in the room cry. "40 years ago," he said, "I was riding through the desert with no particular destination in mind, just drifting like I had been doing for years. And then I heard a scream, and I made a choice to investigate, and that choice changed my entire life. I found Grace that day, and in finding her, I found myself. I found my purpose, my home, my reason for being. Everything good in my life has come from that moment, from that choice to stop and help a stranger. So I want to say thank you, Grace, for letting me find you. Thank you for letting me love you. Thank you for 40 years of happiness." Grace could barely speak through her tears, but she managed to stand and wrap her arms around her husband. "Thank you for stopping," she whispered, the same words she had said so many times over the years. "Thank you for catching our baby. Thank you for catching me." They held each other while their family applauded and cried. And outside the sun was setting over the California desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson and deep purple, the same colors that had filled the sky on that day so long ago, when a cowboy had found a woman giving birth alone on a desert trail and had changed both their lives forever. Jackson Ingram lived to be 78 years old, and Grace was by his side until the very end. He died peacefully in his sleep on a spring morning in 1912, in the big house he had built for his family, surrounded by everyone he loved. His last words, spoken to Grace as she held his hand, were simple and true. "Best life a man could ask for," he whispered. "Thank you for all of it." "Thank you for all of it," Grace whispered back, kissing his weathered hand. "I will see you again someday, my love." Grace lived another 10 years, long enough to see the world change in ways she never could have imagined. She saw automobiles replace horses on the streets of Skidoo, saw airplanes fly overhead, saw women get the right to vote. Through it all, she kept Jackson's memory alive, telling their story to anyone who would listen. The story of the cowboy who had delivered a baby with his bare hands in the middle of the desert became legend in Skidoo and the surrounding area. People said it was the most romantic story they had ever heard, and they were right. When Grace passed away in 1922 at the age of 62, she was buried beside Jackson in the cemetery on the hill overlooking the ranch. Their headstone was simple, bearing both their names and the dates of their births and deaths, but someone had added a line below, a quote that summed up their entire life together. They found each other in the wilderness, and they never let go. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren continued to gather for years afterward, celebrating anniversaries and birthdays and holidays at the ranch that had been built on love and hard work. They would tell the story of Grace and Jackson, of the miraculous way they had met, of the life they had built together against all odds. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the desert wind whispered through the rocks, people swore they could still hear an echo of that long-ago scream, followed by the sound of a baby's first cry, and then laughter, the sound of two people who had found each other in the most impossible circumstances and had chosen love every day for the rest of their lives. The Ingram family thrived for generations, always remembering the story of their ancestors, always knowing that they were the descendants of a love story that had begun with a cowboy catching a baby in the desert and had grown into something beautiful and lasting and true. It was a legacy of love, and it would endure forever, just like the desert itself, harsh and unforgiving but capable of producing the most unexpected and beautiful miracles.